Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is John Hamre, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what's going to be a very interesting hour. We're going to have a discussion about Arnold Punaro's latest book. He's got another one in the works, but this is about how we are in a trap with our budget. And you know, we're on a path where we're getting a more expensive defense budget and less for it every year. We got to do something about that. And that's what we're going to dig into today. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have this session with you. Let me just welcome Senator Sam Nunn, who was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Congressman Mac Thornberry, who was chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Two important leaders that were every step of the way looking to try to reform the department and try to get the conditions better set for to get better value than the path we're on. And welcome to Jen Stewart. Jen was the chief of staff for the House Armed Services Committee, and then was chief of staff to Secretary Mark Esper, a great talent. This is going to be a very interesting session. I'm going to turn this over to Mark Kansian. Mark is a senior fellow here at CSIS. He is he's a long-time student of the Defense Department resource allocation in the Department of Defense. I first met Mark when he was at PA&E. I think we call it CAPE now. I'm not sure, but he was a long-time leader in analytically looking at how do we get value for the defense budget. But I'm really very pleased and congratulations, Arnold, to you for your book, and we look forward to hearing about it all. Mark, let me turn to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamre. As Dr. Hamre has indicated, we have an impressive panel today talking about an important topic. Let me just take a moment to introduce our distinguished panel. You've already heard some of their background. I'm going to start with our author, Major General Arnold Punaro. He was for many years a staff member, senior staff member, and staff director of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was a Marine, wounded in Vietnam, and rose to the ranks to become Major General, commander of the 4th Marine Division. He's been an advisor to many senior officials and head of the Reserve Forces Policy Board, where we worked together for a number of years. We have Senator Sam Nunn, as you all know, led the Senate Armed Services Committee for many years, where he oversaw much consequential legislation, including Goldwater-Nichols legislation. Leaving Congress, or when he was still in Congress, he founded the Nuclear Threat Initiative and has continued his public service as a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, and was chairman of the Board of Trustees here at CSIS. Chairman Thornberry represented Texas 13th Congressional District from 1995 to 2021. He served as the House Armed Services Committee chairman for 2015 to 2019, and after leaving Congress, he has continued to be engaged in national security affairs. Jen Stewart, former chief of staff to Secretary Mark Esper. Before that, she was minority and majority staff director of House Armed Services Committee for Chairman Thornberry, and today she's a vice president at West Exec Advisors. Well, to set the stage here, reforming DoD's structure and processes have been a theme since the beginning of the Republic, but became a major political and institutional issue with the creation of a large standing defense establishment after the Second World War. Since then, there have been repeated waves of reform efforts, some successful, some less so. As General Punaro puts out in the book, the Department of Defense constitutes the world's largest planned economy. Given what we know about the failure of other planned economies like the Soviet Union, that pushes us to be vigilant about efficiencies and the need for reform. It's particularly important now that the United States faces an era of great power competition. After the Cold War, the United States faced only relatively weak regional adversaries, which the United States could overwhelm with its massive resources if necessary. That's no longer possible. In a moment, I'll give General Punaro an opportunity to talk about the background of the book, but first let me hold up a copy so you can all see what this looks like. And there it is. And the book has two aspects, both of which I think are quite interesting. One piece, which we'll talk mostly about, describes challenges and problems with processes and structure. And this discussion focuses on why fighting forces are getting smaller over time. The other part of the book is a review of the major processes and organizations in the national security structure, and it provides an excellent overview for people interested in what's happening there, has the nuances and insights of an insider who's been watching these organizations for many years. So with that introduction, let me get started. And I'll turn the floor over to General Punaro and ask him to, starting off, what caused you to write the book and what are you hoping to be the result?
Well, Mark, thank you. And let me first thank CSIS, its great leader, John Hamre, Mark, who's moderating today, all the technical people for hosting us. It's such a privilege to join these two legendary Chairman of Services Committee and Jen Stewart to talk about a passion of mine. And quite frankly, it's been a life's work. I mean, I first got interested in improving the warfighting side of the military and decreasing the back office as a young second lieutenant platoon commander in Vietnam when we were supposed to be the greatest power in the world. We didn't have dry socks. We didn't have heat tabs for our C rations. We didn't get resupplied with ammunition when we needed it. Things just didn't work the way they were supposed to. And then I lucked out when I got out of the Marine Corps and got out of graduate school to go to work for Senator Nunn. As the conscription force, the draft force, was changed to the volunteer force. And he's been a leading reformer in this area. And then we got to know Mac Thornberry. Chairman Thornberry produced, in my judgment, two of the more legendary historic bills. He's the first one that ever took on the defense agencies. Jen has been involved with that. So the problem, Mark, is that we are spending today more in constant dollars than the peak of the Reagan buildup. And everybody says the Reagan buildup was the bee's knees. That's what we ought to do. And yet the fighting force of our military is 50% smaller. We have 1 million less active duty people. We have 35 to 40,000 less fighting units that actually you go to war with. In Desert Shield, Desert Storm, we had 4,500 fighters in the Air Force. Today we have roughly 2,000. The Navy had 573 battle force ships. Today we have less than 200. We have about 290. I could give you statistics forever. And the problem is our adversaries, particularly China, are on the march. They're on the march militarily, economically, diplomatically, and technologically. And so while our budgets are going up, the output of those budgets is going down. And so it's a great privilege to join these three experts who have spent their careers trying to increase the fighting size of the military, and decrease the tail, which is what my book is all about. In other words, the stuff in the rear with the gear. So that's what motivated me. We really are at an inflection point in our country. If we don't fundamentally improve the capability of our military, particularly technologically, to deter and, if necessary, to defeat our major adversary, which is China, we're going to be in a really, really bad situation, and we've got to get started on it right away. So that's the fundamental, and I hope that the book will spur the kind of changes in the Congress and the Pentagon that are long overdue.
Well, thank you very much. Let me build on that with our first question for the panelists, which is the size of DoD's infrastructure and overhead. You know, the number of field agencies and defense agencies has risen to 33. So let me ask the panel, how did this happen and what might be done to constrain the growth? And are there any of these agencies or field activities that might be eliminated? The DoD might get out of certain kinds of businesses. So I'm going to start with Senator Nunn.
Well, I'm going to defer to Mike Thornberry because he has a lot more experience recently than I do on this subject. But I think about every 10 years, you have to have the equivalent of, and pardon this analogy because we don't want to be like China in this respect, but the Chairman Mao used to have a sort of a revolution. And it was very destructive in many ways, but we need a sort of a mild version of that to take a look at the bureaucracy in our Pentagon. Arnold Punaro starts his book by talking about a noxious weed that started off in the South as a saving us from soil erosion because it did protect the soil, called kudzu. And there were every good intention for kudzu when it started, but it ended up basically overshadowing and strangling most everything around it and became quite a problem, which it still is. Mac, you may not have that in Texas. So I'd say that Arnold had a very good analogy in his book about kudzu and the bureaucracy. I think it's not only the federal agencies. I think that's a big challenge. And I think some reform has come about on that, thanks to Chairman Thornberry. But it's also a rather simple thing, a number of admirals and generals. About every 10 years, you need to cut back on the number of admirals and generals. It's not that they cost so much per se, it's the fact they have to have staffs, and those staffs multiply. And the same thing with headquarters. Every 10 years or so, you need to take a whole look at headquarters around the world and in this country. And the same thing is true with military bases. You get bases that become outmoded. That's the toughest nut of all. And of course, Congress did a pretty good job of that for a while, I'd say for about 20 years with the Base Closure Commission. So this is not, from my perspective, an utter failure. It just has to be revisited very often. And I will leave it to Arnold to talk about the acquisition process, but that has its own set of challenges. So I would say the key thing here is constant review by the Congress, taking a fresh look every 10 years at the bureaucracy, and basically creating a set of incentives that give the Pentagon itself, the military services, and the leaders in the Pentagon incentives to move in the right direction. And that takes a pretty good bit of oversight because you have to scratch pretty deep to know what incentives will really work. But one example of that is what Arnold mentioned, the tooth to tail ratio. We tackled that one way back when Secretary Bo Calloway was Secretary of Army, I believe, President Ford administration. And we basically gave the Army the ability to add back combat forces if they reduced support forces. And it worked. There was a new brigade in NATO. So the right incentives and continuous oversight, to me, are the two fundamental ingredients.
Well, thank you very much. Chairman Thornberry.
Well, thanks, Mark, and I too want to congratulate General Punaro on not only on his book but his persistence on these issues. And I completely agree with Senator Nunn that part of what is required is you have to stay after it. And General Punaro has done that over the years. I relied on him and his advice and his insights when I was on the committee, and that persistence is an important part of it. Why has this developed? Well, partly because we have asked our military to do more and more, and we have become very prescriptive about how they should do it. And so every time a White House or Congress says you got to go through this kind of training, or you got to do this, that, or the other, and you got to do it in this way, that adds to the bureaucracy that supports those sorts of mandates. But part of it too is just organizational, or really human behavior. We all want to grow in our domains and our influence. We want to protect what we've got. And that's the reason, just as Senator Nunn says, you have to have a countervailing force to push back on it, and to push back on that growth and protectionism in order to reach some reasonable balance. As was pointed out, we made an effort on the defense agencies in particular. It didn't turn out as successfully as I would have liked. I guess I would say you got to follow through. just like you need persistence in looking at the problem, you need persistence in holding their feet to the fire. When you give them a target, the military a target to reduce either the number of agencies, the number of people, the amount of budget, you need to stay after it for several years, because you can't just do it in 1 year. And it also works better if there's cooperation between the legislative branch and the executive branch. For example, I know Secretary Esper was really taking a look at combatant commands. Senator Nunn points out they've grown too. And so a cooperative effort from both branches of government is, I really think, essential to get it done and to hold it down.
Thank you very much. Jen Stewart.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hamre, and thank you, Mark and CSIS and the support team for hosting this wonderful event. And to General Punaro, I will tell you, I commend to our audience reading your book. It was both painful because the clarity you provided, but comprehensive roadmap for things that we should be thinking about to be constructive moving forward, to keep our competitive edge and to support the men and women serving our country so faithfully, both in uniform and in their civilian capacities. So Mark, as you were talking about that and building off of Senator Nunn and Congressman Thornberry's points, I keep coming back in my mind, both from the committee perspective, but also from the Pentagon. We are struggling with risk and accountability. And because we are not willing to spread risk off a continuum of time for our leaders, both civilian and military, we're asking them to perfectly manage risk in a current environment. We create a law of the commons problem, where all these layers of bureaucracy that have been added are there because it was a response to something that went wrong. And rather than figuring out a way to allow us to fail successfully and learn, or to fail without having to micromanage a situation, we're holding ourselves hostage to the inability to sort out when accountability is an individual or an organization, or it's just something that was a system problem that we needed to fix and move on. So as we're thinking about what to do about it, I think one of the most important things we need to work into our lexicon and into all our discussions inside the Pentagon, inside the conversations between the Pentagon and the Hill, is really starting to bring into the conversation, where are you assuming risk to maximize flexibility and decision-making for leaders who are going to come after you as the right thing to do as an American? And where can you not assume risk, and where do you need support and not assuming risk, and also where should you be assuming risk?
Great. General Punaro, anything you want to add here at the end?
Well, I agree with all the comments that they've made about what we ought to do about it. Let me give our audience just a little bit of a flavor of the scope of the problem. We're talking here about what I call defense-wide spending, and it's gone from 5% of the budget to about 20%. But if you add in that what we call the pass-through budget, which is classified defense-wide spending that's buried in the Air Force budget, it's closer to 30%. And the support size of the military budget overall is close to 50%. So defense agencies, from 1952, there was one, now there's 28, including the new space agency, hundreds of thousands of people, several $100 billion. And you ask, what would we do? First of all, we don't need to be running a grocery chain in the Department of Defense that's subsidized by the taxpayers $1.4 billion a year, the commissaries. Private for-profit grocery stores have said, let us come in and improve the benefit. These are grocery stores that have sales of $60 billion a year. The commissary has $5 billion. Their sales have been going down every year for the last 5 or 6 years. We could give them a better benefit with no taxpayer subsidy, move that money to the forces. We run a dependent school system on basis where we have great public schools right outside the base, $3.5 billion a year. The Defense Logistics Agency does more business in the Department of Defense than does the largest defense contractors, yet it's run by military people that have never served a day outside government. Those civilian type agencies like DLA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, the Worldwide Communications Agency, should be run by civilians with performance contracts that have had experience and battle tested in the private sector with modern logistics. So there's a lot that could be done here Chairman Thornberry was brave with Jen. They took it on, and as he said, it's a tough nut to crack. But we've got to do it because as I said, we've gone from 1 to 28, and they're just growing topsy-turvy. So we've got to take on these sacred cows. Over.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to jump to an issue that arises from discussion about overhead and infrastructure, and that's civil-military relations. The book points out that the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Secretary's staff, has grown from 2 to 6 under secretaries and now 20 plus assistant secretaries. The Joint Staff has also increased in size and scope of its activities. The combatant commanders are now mini Pentagons and get involved in a lot of political military issues. Some people argue that we have a civil military crisis, that the Office of Secretary of Defense is too weak compared to the Joint Staff and needs to be expanded and strengthened, that the combatant commanders are getting into too many issues. So let me ask our panel, first, do you think we have a civil military relations crisis? And I would point out that many of the people who have argued this are now in the administration. And second, what does this mean as for our structuring of these headquarters organizations? So again, I'll start with Senator Nunn.
Well, the Goldwater-Nichols bill tried to strengthen the civilian control, giving the Secretary of Defense more authority by basically getting military advice that was sound advice for the Secretary of Defense, and also by strengthening the forces out in the field and the combatant commanders that basically are so important in terms of the actual war fighting. But one of the things looking back on Goldwater-Nichols, which I don't think was a mistake, but I think what we did when we created joint training, when we created a joint staff of highly professional people, when we strengthened the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs as the principal military advisor to the president, when we basically gave the service chiefs more management responsibility, all those things, the military got a lot better. The Joint Staff military got a lot better. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a Goldwater-Nichols for civilians in terms of training and experience and so forth. So right now, you could say, is that failure or was it's success that we need to learn lessons from on the civilian side? I would say the latter. I think the answer is not to weaken the experience, the knowledge, the cooperation between the various services, and the streamlined, more command and control. But the answer is to find ways to have better trained civilians. Now, the inherent problem is the military are career people. They stay for years and years. Civilians turn over. We have to strengthen the service secretaries. The caliber of people serving as service secretaries has to go up. And this is not criticizing any of those those who've gone before, but they rotate in and out. And by the time they're confirmed, and that confirmation process of civilians ought to particularly be accelerated. It tends to be a lot harder to confirm civilians than it does to have military people promoted, even those that go through the Armed Services Committee confirmation. So if you're going to take a already rotating civilian leadership group that rotate a lot more than military, and then you're going to slow down the confirmations, by the time they get confirmed and they start looking for an exit strategy toward the end of that president's term, they serve about 2 years, 2.5 years. How in the world, even if they have exactly the same intelligence and capabilities as the military, how are they going to compete with that knowledge? And knowledge is power in Washington. So I think we have to look at the core of the tenure of service. I think we have to look hard at the confirmation process because it really needs repair beyond just this problem. It's in great disrepair. So I would say those are the things we need to do. I would strengthen very much the role of the service secretaries, but you have to strengthen their background and qualifications too. Senator Warner and I embarked on that. It got interrupted by the tremendous controversy over a confirmation, but we basically laid out before a presidential election by writing both nominees saying that we were no longer going to confirm people for service secretary positions if they were not really very well qualified. And we laid out in a whole letter. Now that got disrupted, but I would say it's worthy of a renewed try.
Thank you. Chairman Thornberry.
Well, I think Jen's point about accountability is really important here. If you'll remember a few years ago, Secretary Robert Gates fired a few people. And sometimes, you know, that helps get folks' attention and also reminds everybody who's in charge. So part of it gets to be, I think, a function of personality. I do think it's a mistake to think that, okay, if we just increase the staff of one or the other, that's going to put them in a better position. Part of the problem that we were just talking about a few minutes ago is that the staff, whether they're civilian or with the joint staff or the combatant commands, grow because somebody's got to talk to the other elements. And so you just get this escalation of growing staff who talk to each other. And that doesn't really make the nation any stronger. And I'd just say, finally, I think Senator Nunn's point about having the confirmation process, having so many actings, which is what we're seeing today. And so more broadly, our political dysfunction does translate into less authority for those who have to go through the political confirmation process. And I do think that's part of what we're seeing now. Of course, the answer is to go the other way and have a better functioning system through confirmations and budget accountability and other things. That helps reemphasize the importance of civilian control.
Thank you, Chairman. Jen Stewart.
Oh, Mark, this is going to be the landmine field question for me, having friends on both sides of the conversation and getting an opportunity to see it from both the joint staff perspective and OSD. I would say it's first important to really focus on what we mean by CivMil, which needs to be deeper and more authentic than just making sure that from a public relations perspective, no one in uniform is saying anything too politically contentious. And candidly, CivMil conversations can drift into that kind of shallow space. But if you really think about it institutionally, there's a couple things that can be done now that don't require anyone to take any legislative action. The first is the secretary sets the tone. Bureaucratically, everyone knows who's going to be the last voices in the room. And when you have a secretary, and Secretary Esper was one of these secretaries, that insisted on having service secretaries in the room, insisted on having as OSD leads in the room for serious conversations, particularly involving war plans, you're sending a message to the military that their professional advice and recommendations are going to be heard and folded into the final decision, but that the civilian leadership is going to be in the room supporting the secretary and making the final decision. So no one needs to wait to make sure that that balance is healthy. And then beyond that, it's making sure that on the civilian side, that you're exercising control and direction and discipline in place of, I'm giving you strategic guidance and I'm holding you accountable for that, but I'm not trying to do your job for you. And then on the military side, it's making sure that everyone understands that starting a sentence with my best military advice doesn't automatically make the rest of the sentence appropriate if you're getting into policy or political issues that are best left to the civilians. And so I think there's a way to demonstrate control without being controlling. And there's a way to make sure that people are staying focused on what I would consider their comparative advantage and strengths and not trying to do other people's jobs, which is usually 90% of complaints about CivMil in the Pentagon, as you know, Mark.
I'm smiling, yes. General Punaro, anything you would like to add here at the end?
Certainly our three panelists have given excellent points, and I agree with all of them. I'd like to make just a couple of points. In Goldwater-Nichols, Title 10 says everything in the department is subject to the authority, direction, and control of the Secretary of Defense, and that rolls over to the civilian leadership in OSD and the military departments as well as the military. And if you have the right civilian leader of the Pentagon, you're not going to have a problem. Now, before Goldwater-Nichols, if you had a Jim Schlesinger, by dint of his intellect, he could convince the military to do what he wanted. And if you have the right civilian leader, Mac Thornberry pointed out, Bob Gates, Mark Esper was very much in charge, as Jen said. I personally have never been in favor of retired military serving as Secretary of Defense right after they retired. That's why the law had 10 years, but unfortunately we put the waiver in. Now it's been granted twice. I hate to say it, as much as I admire and respect Jim Mattis and Lloyd Austin, you just don't shed 45 years of military experience after 2 years, and you basically are too close to the military side of it. So I really don't think that we ought to have retired military. Number two, General Jim Jones, former commandant, former SACUR, Admiral Mike Mullen, former chairman, have talked about how they think some of our flag and general officers in retirement have become too political. Certainly they have every right to do that. I don't think it's a good thing. Certainly some on active duty. I personally think General Milley crossed the line when he basically talked to these people that were writing these tell-all books. Now that it's come out, it's put our military and his leadership in a very, very bad situation. And finally, I'm with Mac Thornberry. You don't need to add to the staffs. We need to improve the quality of the civilians we hire. We need to give the civilian workforce in the department the same training and professional development opportunities we give the military. So, as Senator Nunn said, that we need great improvements there. We had legendary civil servants that used to work in the department that were the continuity. All of them now have retired, and that's got to be rebuilt.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to move on to some other issues that the book raises. And the first one is a major issue that General Punaro raised, which are personnel costs. CSIS has done a study showing that these costs have increased over the last 2 decades. On the other hand, proposals for savings meet ferocious opposition from associations in the retirement communities, if not DoD itself. So my question is, how did these personnel costs get so high, and what can we do about it? Are there elements that maybe we could trim that would reduce some of these costs without damaging recruiting and retention? So I'll start with Senator Nunn.
Well, I think you have to protect the people who are already in the military who came in on one set of rules. That means you start by grandfathering at least 10 years, maybe 20 years into at least very significant changes. But as Arnold related, we did that on a couple of occasions. Just one example, the military was retiring at one point at the highest pay they ever received. And the civilian corps were retired at the average of the high 3 years. And we changed over to reflect that on the military side, grandfathered it over 20 years. At the point it really started accruing and kicking in, I think it was a couple of $2 billion a year, and that got repealed. The service chiefs have a responsibility here too, because in that case, my understanding is they led the charge in repealing that right before it was going to start saving a couple of $1 billion a year. And we had protected everybody for 20 years it was in. So it wasn't changing the rules as you go. So I think the service leaders, the military leaders have a responsibility here. Civilians and the Congress have to make the decisions. But if the military stirs up opposition to any kind of reform on personnel change, if the leaders do, they're going to find exactly what Arnold's book said, and that is the personnel costs are eating up the procurement, and the military people serving are less well equipped. They have less advantages technologically speaking, and they are at more risk. And I think if you really ask questions, would you really want to see your risk increase and your effectiveness decrease in order to protect every single benefit? That question needs to be posed by the service chiefs because Congress gets overwhelmed. Anytime you do anything and I know Mac and Jen both know this, if you do anything to change the pay or the benefits, even with a grandfather provision protecting anyone, the only people who know about it, they're not your constituents out there that know about it. They basically, it's the people in the military that know about it and the military publications that know about it. So you get no support politically for doing it, and you get all the criticism for doing it. So there needs to be much more of an educational effort by the military leaders. And that's not the only answer. It takes a lot more continuous courage in the Congress too. I don't give any blue ribbons to Congress on this point.
Great. Chairman Thornberry.
Well, I'd cite another example. A few years ago, when Senator McCain was chairman, we were able to reform the military retirement system, and we did it largely in the way that Senator Nunn outlined. We grandfathered in folks who were invested to a certain degree. New people had to go with the new system, and then there was a group in between that could choose which was better for them. And we're still in the process of transitioning into that new system, but it's going to save the taxpayers at least $1 billion a year. But in addition to that, for the younger folks who may not stay in the military 20 years, it enables them to develop some savings that they can have to go about their life. And so I think, and just another point on that, we created a commission to study the issue of military retirement and give us recommendations. And so largely what we were able to do in the authorization bill is take those commission recommendations, tweak them a little bit, and then get them signed into law. And so I think that is a good template for some of the changes that need to be made. There's no question that healthcare is the most vexing problem, not only for the military, but for the rest of society as well. And it has its own host of challenges. The only other thing I would say, Mark, is we got to step back and also remember that we have an all-volunteer force, and currently only roughly, say, 25% of those in the eligible age group are eligible to serve in the military, either because of legal problems or physical problems or mental, So you got a pretty small pool to go from, to draw from. And we've got to continue to get the best and the brightest from it. So there is a cost to that for us that authoritarian nations do not have. So I do think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. The last point I'd make is part of our challenge is the rigidity of the personnel system. We're asking active duty folks to do all sorts of things because it's so hard to get anybody else in or out. A lot of folks talk about getting somebody in temporarily to work on cyber or some of these other things. I think the rigidity of the system increases the costs in the system beyond that which is necessary. And so some flexibility, some other options would help.
Thank you very much.
Mac, one thing I'd like to just ask Mac, this has been a problem a long time and it may have been changed recently, and that is the up or out policy, where you basically serve 20 years. And it seems to me that with the skills needed now, the computer skills, all the other skills that are not directly related to young people's physical conditioning, that we need to have a retention policy for the highly desirable and needed skills in the military and create incentives for people to stay longer in the military, particularly when they have those kind of skills. Has that been really addressed in recent years?
We tried to address it, Senator. Whether we've been successful or not, I can't tell you, because it takes a few years to sort out, whether you have been able to retain somebody who, at a certain rank, who has certain skills. We tried to identify cyber and some of those other critical areas, but whether it's successful, I think it's too soon to tell.
Okay, great. Now to Jen Stewart.
Well, I want to pull forward the comments that Senator Nunn and Chairman Thornberry were saying. And for General Punaro, this was part of the book that was the most painful to read because the clarity and the truthfulness you brought to these issues, particularly talking about the accruing costs that we put on the personnel system during the height of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. I commend your readers to pay attention to that section because it's quite powerful. But the piece I want to pull forward is this question about, we are actually at an inflection point right now where we know we've identified certain skills and functions that we need to grow, that we're candidly very bad at recruiting to, let alone retaining. And when I look at some of the service chiefs who've come out in good faith and say, we need a new framework through which we're going to recruit and retain, I applaud that, but I worry without the data and the discipline to know where we're going to place those bets, and then the discipline to hold to those areas, we're going to end up adding additional layers of personnel costs across the board, because this is running counter into, and it's very painful to chat about it, but it's running counter into core values of belonging to the military from a fairness and parity perspective when we talk about the pay and the associated benefits that we give for people who wear the cloth of the nation. And so starting with the data and then starting with the strategy is going to be incredibly important. And it's one of the areas where we need to encourage and hold our civilian and military leaders, both in the executive branch and then our civilian leaders on the Hill, accountable to show us how they're going to do that.
Great, thank you. General Punaro, any concluding comments here?
So I would say the backdrop for this is President Nixon asked the former Secretary of Defense Gates, not Bob Gates, but the first Secretary Gates, to do a commission to look at whether or not we should get rid of the draft, which was hugely unpopular in the peak of the Vietnam War, and go to a volunteer force. That commission recommended that, the volunteer force. It initiated in 1973, the year basically when Senator Nunn got to the Senate a little bit sooner. I got there in 73, became chairman of the personnel subcommittee. The volunteer force was going down the tubes in the 70s. It had to be saved in the late 70s and early 80s. The Gates said the volunteer force will not be successful and will not be affordable if you don't change three things. One, the upper out promotion system that Senator Nunn and Mac have referenced. He said you have to get rid of the 20-year cliff retirement and keep people longer. And three, you have to change the pay system from time and grade to skills and performance. We've done none of that really, even though Chairman Thornberry and Chairman Nunn tried. Chairman Nunn is chairman of the personnel, looked at the Defense Officer Personnel Management Act in the late 70s, but the military fought every change that would have made it better and less rigid, as Chairman Thornberry suggests. They want the person that serves in the butter line to get paid the same as the tank turret mechanic. And they are apoplectic about the 20-year retirement. And by the way, as Chairman Thornberry said, one of the reasons they put in the new retirement system was only 17% of the people that ever served earned the 20-year retirement. Most of the people that served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, never earned a nickel in retirement because they didn't make it to 20 years. And so now, as he said, we have something that incentivizes. I would focus the benefits on those currently serving. The problem is most of the benefits now have shifted to those no longer serving. 2.4 million retirees compared to 1.3 million active duty. 65% of the $52 billion a year healthcare budget goes to retirees. Of 10 million beneficiaries, 5.6 million are retirees and their dependents. And people retire at 20 years, at 43 if you're enlisted, 45 if you're an officer. People live to their early 80s, so we're paying them now for over 60 years to serve for 20 years. So it's the deferred piece, and it has to be done. Everybody has to be grandfathered, but frankly, if we don't make these changes, this is why the active duty military keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller, because the fully burdened cost of a soldier is now $400,000 a year.
Well, thank you. I want to shift gears here a little. The book points out that the problems aren't all in the executive branch, that Congress also has its share of challenges, and those come in two areas. One is about oversight and criticisms that Congress has moved away from its oversight responsibilities and has tended to reinforce what the administration has proposed, particularly if Congress and the administration are of the same party. So, what can be done to strengthen those oversight capabilities and responsibilities? And the other piece is about Congress getting its work done on time, that appropriations and authorization bills have been late. The book suggests some possible changes, for example, even combining the authorization and appropriations committees. But I wanted to, again, hear from the panel, what their thoughts are about how Congress can do its business better. So Senator Nunn.
Well, some of this has been talked about for years, and it's much easier to say than it is do. But I think you have a budget committee, you have an authorization committee, and you have an appropriation committee. Everybody gets 3 bites at the apple, at least 2 big bites and 1 small bite on the budget committee to begin with. I think, in a perfect world, you'd have 2 of those committees, not 3. The second thing is we tried at the authorization level to have a 2-year budget where the first year was about authorizing, appropriating the money. The second year was oversight. That is the biggest failing of Congress, in my view, not just in defense, but throughout the whole government. And that is the lack of oversight. Everything is about, as Arnold says so well in his book, about input measurement rather than output measurement. And the third thing I would mention, and we should not forget this, because I think it's the most important responsibility of Congress, but it has eroded tremendously, and that is war powers. The War Powers Act reform was attempted when I first got to the Senate, and I voted for it. It did not work. It has not worked. Congress's basically most important responsibility is the declaration of war. Now, in nuclear age, that has to be adjusted. We know that. But right now, Congress is not really exercising that function, and that has to be revisited. Senator Warner, Senator Byrd, and I tried to tackle a whole rewrite of the War Powers Act. It's worth looking at as a matter, at least of history, and it's worth looking at for a few hints today, but it would have to be dramatically updated. But right now, as an interim step before addressing the whole question of war powers with a new statute, I think there needs to be a liaison committee so that the executive branch, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and President will have a small group of people to talk to about what I call existential interests. That would include nuclear, it would include contagious disease and biological in all likelihood, it would include NATO, and it would include Russia, and it would include China. The leadership needs to appoint that kind of committee. You may want basically a subcommittee of that, but those are crucial issues. And so many times today, it's almost impossible not to get the vital confused with the vivid. And that's what happens over and over again. So to have some kind of committee to link with the executive branch, to be kept informed by the executive branch, to participate and share the responsibilities of war and peace. We've got to make those kind of decisions much better in the next 30 years than we have in the last 30.
Thank you very much. Chairman Thornberry.
Well, I think it's important just to remember that with all the political dysfunction that exists on Capitol Hill and throughout our political system, the one area that is holding together for Republicans and Democrats to be able to cooperate and get bills passed is the defense area. And so you've seen even this year out of committee and off the whole House, out of the Senate committee, and hopefully in the next week or so out of the full Senate, enormous margins for defense authorization bills. And so there's a lot of dysfunction, but coming together on national defense has so far been able to hold together, but it's getting harder and harder. And so that's kind of the context that I think we have to see these issues. I've always referred back to a CSIS report from more than a decade ago that looked at this question. And one of the points it made was in conducting its oversight, Congress needs to look at the big questions that only Congress can ask as the key connector between the American public and our national security. The danger is Congress gets down in the weeds and does battle with all the majors in the Pentagon. And so they keep you busy, and we don't ask the big question, or Congress doesn't ask the big questions, focus on the key issues. And I've got to confess, one of my goals was to reduce the size of the annual defense authorization bill, and I failed miserably, because it's one of the few things that actually gets through. Everybody wants to put everything on it. And so that might be another goal. I would endorse Senator Nunn's point, though, about a cross-cutting committee. Increasingly, national security issues are not stovepiped for one department or one domain. Things like cyber or bio threats, et cetera, go across a number of committees, and somehow Congress has to modernize itself to reflect the way that national security is not as neatly defined and contained as it has been in the past. So I think that is exactly right.
Thank you very much. Jen Stewart.
You know, I think this is an area where sometimes I think I'm too self-limiting given all the time I've served in Congress. But I think it's important to remember that institutionally, we need to remember constitutionally, Congress has the power of the purse. And so from that perspective, keeping a functional legislative process in place on the Hill always has to be the guiding principle. And to Chairman Thornberry's point, I'm the one who failed miserably when he instructed smaller bills and they kept getting larger. But one of the things we don't talk about is it's become the engine to move other pieces of legislation across the goal line. And so keeping that capacity at both the staff and member level to know how to legislate, know how to cut deals, know how to build coalitions, both on the Hill and external coalitions, is something that I think sometimes we pocket as a given and we can never take for granted. But, you know, when I was looking at some of the recommendations in the book, and it's things that we've debated ourselves on the Hill, I've tried to remember that you can't change anyone but yourself. You can only influence others. And so remembering what's important to others, what their equities are in this process, I think is important. So asking the appropriators to cede control is, you know, starting from a point of failure because they're not going to. Where I found the administration was effective in moving Congress is when they clearly illuminated, with sunlight being the best disinfectant, the risk and the opportunity costs of where Congress was choosing, in the administration's view, a bad bet, and they could explain it in a way that Congress couldn't weasel out of or squirm out of accepting the consequences of. So there have been certain services, certain parts of OSD that have effectively made that case, and they were effective in moving the needle and modernizing key areas that they wanted to modernize. And so constantly, I keep coming back to data and analytics and forcing the questions based on facts and focusing on laying out clear trade-off choices and then telling the Congress, you may not choose what we chose, but you're going to have to own both your decision and the opportunity cost of what you didn't choose.
Thank you. General Punaro.
Well, obviously, I agree with all the points of the panelists, and I would like to emphasize something Chairman Thornberry said, and that is the bipartisan nature of the defense committees. And if you look at the history of the committees, I mean, we were adding money in the Carter administration when it was too low on a bipartisan basis. This year, 3 of the 4 committees added $25 billion over what the administration requested. If you look at when Mac chaired and Adam Smith was the ranking member, and now Adam is the chair and Mike Rogers the ranking, they've over the years really always produced and worked on a bipartisan basis, and we need to emphasize that. An oasis in the otherwise, in my view, in Congress. Number 2, they should focus on macro management, as both Senator Nunn and Mac said, and Jen, not micromanagement, the line item details. And the area there is, I think, technology. We have got to focus on the key technologies that are key, not just for the Department of Defense, but for our own economy to be competitive in the world economies. You know what they are: 5G, microelectronics, quantum, hypersonics for the military. And the way we do our hearings and structures now, the way we have continuing resolutions for the last 20 years, doesn't allow our industry, where you're going to get all this technology. Government doesn't produce anything anymore. Government does not innovate anymore. Industry has to be able to focus on and find out what are the big blue arrows that the committees want us to do. And same for the department. So I think the macro management, and then finally, October the 1st comes the same time every year. The fiscal year used to start on 1 July, and the Congress could never meet the 1 July, so they moved it to 1 October in 1977, and they still never meet the deadline. Congress needs to, as Jen said, the number one thing is the power of the purse. You can control anything through the power of the purse. They need to get their work done on time. They need to focus on the big picture. They need to look at the technologies that basically are going to deter or defeat China.
Well, thank you very much. We're down to our last question. This is going to be something of a lightning round, so I'm going to ask our panelists to be brief. But we've spent a lot of time talking about problems and challenges, but the fact is the United States has produced arguably the best military on the planet, so we're clearly doing some things right. My question then to the panelists is, what are we doing right, and what can we learn from that in terms of reforming some of the things that we're not doing so well at? Senator Nunn.
Well, if you look at things that have worked, the all-volunteer force has worked. It had to be dramatically reformed. Congress did that. Goldwater Nichols has greatly strengthened the military advice the President of the United States get. I think that has to be said as work. The Special Forces legislation that came out of Congress, Bill Coyne was a real leader there, creating a Special Forces Command that has worked very well. We've had base closing commissions that have worked, and we have basically looked at the number of admirals and generals, and that's worked. But if you look at the bottom line is we've got tremendous leadership in the military. We have tremendous skills in our enlisted personnel. We have a tremendous dedication of men and women in the military. We have American public supporting the military. This is not like the post-Vietnam period. This military enjoys tremendous support from American people, which in the final analysis may be the most important area. So the technology, the industry that helped win World War II is absolutely essential today. Arnold's correct on that. So if you look at us compared to any other country in the world, we're still the best, and we need to keep that in mind. And we certainly have the best military in the world, without any doubt. We should be grateful for that. What we're all talking about is trajectory, the way it's heading, the trends that are alarming. And Arnold, I think, deserves a blue ribbon for pointing these things out so that we can keep our men and women in the military the best equipped, the best trained in the world.
Thank you very much. Chairman Thornberry.
Number one thing that works is our people. And remember, every single one of them and their families are volunteers. They make the choice to serve. And despite what we were talking about earlier, most of them don't do it for the money. They do it because they want to serve. And that's the number one thing that makes our military successful. I would say the number two things that works in the country in general is innovation. And our challenge is to bring that innovation throughout the country, not just from traditional defense suppliers, but from the whole economy, bring it to bear on the national security problems that face us, especially compared to us in China. So it's people and innovation, the two things.
Thank you very much. Jen Stewart.
Mark, I'll be quick. I would say it's our people and the values that we instill in them, including discipline, critical thinking skills, leadership, innovation. That's what sets us apart.
Great. Thank you very much. And the last word, General Punaro.
Let me double up on what the three of them have said about people. The people that come to work in the Pentagon, on Capitol Hill in the authorizing committees, the defense appropriations subcommittees, active duty, Guard and Reserve, defense civilians, defense contractors, congressional staffers, every one of them tries to do the very best job they can for our taxpayers and our warfighters. Their dedication is unsurpassed, and they're working within these cumbersome processes. So the people are the heart and soul, and we've got to keep that focus and improve it where we can. But our people, the dedication is just incredible, and we need to support them more than we are now.
Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of our time, and we've really only scratched the surface of some of the issues that the book raises. We weren't able to talk, for example, about the acquisition system or the budgeting system, both of which have challenges, and the book talks about some of those challenges and maybe some things we might do. To my panelists, thank you very much for joining us. This has been a great session.
One footnote.
Senator.
Great book, Arnold. Great service for the country. One critique. You started off talking about kudzu. You never told us how to get rid of it.
Agent Orange.
Not going there. We've tried that. Okay, so on behalf of CSIS, I want to thank my panelists for joining us, and thank you all out there for listening on this session. Thank you.